morning, everybody, and welcome to today's event, Taiwan Elections and Reflections. My name is Janet Steele, and I'm the Interim Director of the Seeger Center for Asian Studies and also a professor of journalism at the School of Media and Public Affairs. As most of you know already, the Seeger Center is the only center of its type in the Washington, D.C. area, and we host many events about Taiwan, China, and other parts of Asia. The purpose of our center is to improve the quality of research and education about Asia and to promote greater dialogue between the policy community, the academic community, the public, and our students. The Seeger Center is also the academic home of the Asian Studies program, which is the largest in the Washington, D.C. area. We have more than 60 faculty members who work on Asia. So I'm very pleased to welcome you all here on behalf of the Seeger Center. Along with the GW Institute for Korean Studies, we've recently been named as the only national resource center for East Asia in the Washington, D.C. area. Our active and vibrant Taiwan program, the largest among D.C. area universities, is an important and special part of the National Resource Center for East Asian Studies. We're very happy to be hosting today's program, which is part of our Taiwan event series. Today, we have 6 very distinguished speakers and 2 equally distinguished moderators, Alexa Alice Jobin and Deepa Olapalli. Our first panel is going to be moderated by my friend and colleague, Professor Alexa Alice Jobin, who's a professor of English, Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, International Affairs, East Asian Languages and Literature, and Theater. She co-directs the Taiwan Education and Research Program and is an affiliate faculty at the Institute for Korean Studies. She's the inaugural recipient of the Bell Hooks Legacy Award and holder of the Martin Luther King Jr. Award. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Alexa. And I have to apologize, I have a class. So I'm going to go and I will be back after lunch. So thank you, Alexa.
Thank you, Janet. Warm welcome, everyone. I'm Alexa. The ruling Democratic Progressive Party in Taiwan won the unprecedented 3rd term in January 2024 in a tight 3-way race as President-elect Lai Ching-te readies the transition to inauguration in May. What are we learning about the key policy issues at home and abroad? What does the new political environment suggest for Taiwan's democracy and identity? What lessons can we learn from Chinese tactics related to the elections? This morning's panel focuses on domestic issues, and I am really honored to introduce our 3 distinguished panelists, and they'll be speaking in the order from my right-hand side to the left. So I'm going to introduce them in the order. First, we have Professor Yaqiu Wang, who is a research director of China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan at Freedom House. She leads the organization's research on human rights issues within China and the Chinese government's global influence. Prior to joining Freedom House, Professor Wang was senior China researcher at Human Rights Watch, working on issues including internet censorship, protection of human rights defenders, and women's rights. She has also written extensively on the Chinese government's role in undermining human rights globally and multinational corporations' complicity in human rights violations in China. She has also worked on press freedom issues in China and other Asian countries for the Committee to Protect Journalists. Ms. Wang was born and grew up in China and has an MA degree in International Affairs from George Washington University. She has testified before the US Congress and is frequently quoted by major news outlets, including the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, The Guardian, and has appeared on CNN, NBC, NPR, and BBC. Dr. Qiaoning Su is the Associate Professor in Communication, Journalism, and Public Relations at Oakland University. She also serves as the Director of the Public Relations Program and the Klein Center for Culture and Globalization, as well as PRSSA's academic advisor. Young Oakland University, Dr. Su served as the 2018-20 President of the Association for Chinese Communication Studies and the Non-Resident Fellow of the Taiwan Next Gen Foundation. Dr. Su received her PhD in Media and Communication from Temple University in 2015. Her research focuses on two distinct yet very interconnected research lines, namely journalism of crisis and journalism in crisis. While the first line examines the representation and production of crisis news, the second focuses on journalism and public life during an era of waning democracy. And I personally take a great interest in these topics because I also study representations, for instance, of Asianness in film and public media. Her work has been published in journals such as Media, Culture and Society, International Journal of Communication, Asian Journal of Communication, Taiwan Journal of Democracy, and Communication Review. She is the recipient of the 2020 Honors College Inspiration Award and the 2021 Teaching Excellence Award at Oakland University. Yeah, most wonderful. Dr. Su cared to add that in her leisure time, she likes to travel and read, which I very much share. And she's always in search for a good story and the hidden messages behind the narratives. Last but not least, we have Professor Shelley Rigger, who is the Brown Professor of Asian Studies at Davidson College. She teaches courses on East Asian politics, including domestic politics of East Asian countries and the international relations of the region. Her research and writing focuses on Taiwanese politics and on the relationships among the United States, the People's Republic of China, and Taiwan. In 2019-2020, she was a Fulbright scholar at National Taiwan University in Taipei, studying the political and social views of Taiwanese youth. She has been a visiting professor at two universities in the PRC, at Fudan in 2006 and at Shanghai Jiaotong in 2013 and 15. And she was a visiting researcher at National Zhengzhi University in Taiwan in 2005, amazingly beautiful campus hill. I had the honor of visiting the same university last fall. She's also non-resident fellow of the China Policy Institute at Nottingham University and a senior fellow of the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Professor Shelley she interacts frequently with US government officials, especially in the Taiwan policy field. Among her books, she's written many books, there are two academic books on Taiwan's domestic politics. Politics in Taiwan, Voting for Democracy, 1999, and From Opposition to Power, Taiwan's Democratic Progressive Party, 2001. And she also has two books for general readers, which I highly recommend. Why Taiwan Matters, Small Island Global Powerhouse. And The Tiger Leading the Dragon. What a title. The Tiger Leading the Dragon, How Taiwan Propelled China's Economic Rise, 2021. So this is the latest. She has published articles on Taiwan's domestic politics and national identity issues in Taiwan-China relations, generational politics in Taiwan, and other related topics. So hearty welcome to our three panelists. I'm going to start with Professor Wang here. Thank you. All right.
First, I wanted to clarify, I am no professor, although I wish I were. I only got an MA from this very school in 2011. It's great to be back. I remember the days I was a student here. I came for those events just for the free food. So I hope the food is good for lunch. In any case, I am extremely honored to be here. You know, I was once a student, I was there, now I'm here. So, but trust me, you could fare better 10 years later. I'm going to speak on the Chinese government's election interference, disinformation, especially on social media, also by traditional media. My talk will be based on a study Freedom House did in pre-election, which gives the context of this talk is the Beijing global media influence. We did a study in 30 countries. Taiwan is one of the countries in terms of how the Beijing's penetration and in information space in the 30 countries we studied. And the conclusion that in Taiwan that Beijing's efforts to influence the information environment is very high, but the resilience in countering that influence is also very high. In this election just passed in just being held in January, I don't know whether you guys were observing online. I was, and in terms of in the space of social media, there were just a lot of trolls on any kind of social media platforms, whether it's Twitter, TikTok, WhatsApp, or the ones that were popular in Taiwan, particularly online, the messaging app Line, that you can see a lot of trolls there. That then there were also one distinct incident was the fake poll, and then there was one person who actually got arrested for he didn't contact the poll, for posting fake polls. And there has always been disinformation on social media trying to influence Taiwan elections. I think that the trend this time I observe is the use of AI, the deep fakes. You probably saw, Lai Ching-te, the DPP candidate, say things that he never said. And then even a few days before the election, my Twitter DM received a book, a PDF about Tsai Ing-wen's personal stories. A lot of people received this in Chinese, and I opened it. Obviously, it was fake, but it was so poorly done. I read it, and I was like, it is so poorly done that I was thinking whoever was the contractor of the Chinese government for putting up this thing should be fired. Interestingly, that when I read the content, I felt it could be AI generated. Then I also saw videos of voices narrating the PDF. So that could also be AI generated. So my point is that I saw more of that kind of AI involved disinformation on Chinese social media that targeting the Taiwan citizens. In terms of traditional media, whether it's online or offline, that disinformation has always been going on way prior to this election. If you're interested, you can check our Freedom House's report. It gives you a very big the context of how Beijing over the years shape the media coverage in Taiwan through, let's say, pro-Beijing media business people buying the outlets, own the outlets, through Beijing buying editorial in local newspapers, through content sharing by Chinese state media or media backed by the Chinese state with local Taiwanese media, in overall to shape the media environment, the traditional media environment, whether it's it's the radio, whether it's news website, whether it's TV. So in terms of the narratives I observed during the prior and during election time, I would divide it to two kinds. One is that there's a clear message, clear narrative. For example, one is that the election is rigged. There were some fake videos about a woman was reading out the form, then the other woman was recording the result, but it wasn't matching. So later, it was found that the video wasn't depicting the full picture. So, the election is rigged. Another clear message was that, if you're electing the DPP, it will cause war because the DPP is more, on the pro-independence or pro-status quo side. So if you, as a citizen, if you elected Lai, it would trigger Beijing to attack Taiwan. So please don't do that. That was what the Beijing wants to see. Then the others related is called the Yi Luan. Is that the U.S. should not be trusted in the event of an attack by China. So please do not support the DPP. Then besides the narrative that is very clear, that's the message, and they are the ones that, the message isn't clear. As I mentioned, the Taiwan's personal history, like all this salacious stuff. In the past, it was about whether he actually got a PhD. Then this time it's about Lai Ching-te, whether he had a whatever affair or love child. Then the vice president candidate from DPP, Xiao Meiqing, whether he still had a U.S. citizenship, things like that, personal attacks on candidate. Then another is really just about like economic issues that regular people care. One big thing that caused the chaos was the imported act. Somehow the imported act has some safety issues, which led people to go to supermarket to hoard eggs. The whole point, there wasn't a clear political message. The whole point was to spread that kind of information, to cause chaos, to sow discord. The purpose of that is just to erode trust in the society, in the the democratic institutions, in the media space. So that is more a long-term goal in shaping the information environment in a way to create a fertile ground for disinformation to be receptive by the Taiwan citizens. Now I'm going to talk about the response by different actors in the society. I think the response is whole society is multifaceted from the government. It's multifaceted. This is one character. The other I wanted to mention is it's really fast. I think this, the whole Taiwan society did a very good job. When some kind of narrative that is false gets spreaded, you can see how quickly the government respond to that, civil society organizations to respond to that. From the government side, there was the Central Election Commission had put out press conferences, put out messages when there's like disinformation messages got circulated as a way, in a very prompt way to counter the fake news online. And in 2022, the Taiwan government is set up the Ministry of Digital Affairs that it was a core goal to counter disinformation. And in 2020, they passed the Anti-Infiltration Act. The act empowers government to investigate in foreign interference activities, whether it's lobby, whether it's spread disinformation online, things like that. And also they, besides investigations, they fined organizations for engaging in illegal activities and made some arrests. So the government, there was a mandate for each government agencies. If you go on their Facebook, you can see that if when some message got spread that were not true, you can see how the government quickly post on their own Facebook message from the government, countering that disinformation message, and also in a very clear language, easily understood. So I think the government did a good job in terms of civil society. I mean, this is a Freedom House works with civil society organizations in Taiwan as a core mission to empower civil society, to empower civil resilience to counter authoritarianism. In the Taiwan civil society space, there were the many organizations with the core mission to counter disinformation, like MyGoPen, Fact Check Center, Doublethink Lab. I was in Taiwan in December, participating in a big conference organized by Doublethink Lab on disinformation. Then beyond the civil society organizations that their job is to counter disinformation. And then there are also the journalists who are providing the fact-based information. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of media outlets in Taiwan, traditional media outlets are pro-Beijing because the owner of the media outlets like had business interests in China. But, our conversations with even journalists working those outlets, they do their little daily resistance in that context to push back their leadership's efforts to shape how events are covered, whether it's to argue back to your supervisor, your editor, or sometimes just ignore what they are telling you to cover in a way as a civil resistance to protect the integrity of the information, to protect the independence of journalism. In terms of how citizens were part of this counter disinformation effort, my conversation with Taiwan people are that they're very much aware of the disinformation campaign by the CCP. So when you have high awareness, of course, when you read the message, you start to think whether this is actually, from CCP-backed disinformation. Of course, I mean, the kind of high awareness is closely related to the civil society and the government's efforts to promote media literacy, to raise awareness of the issue. The last election in 2020, the CCP's disinformation campaign really backfired. People knew that was the kind of stuff circulating on the internet came from the Chinese government, especially in the context of Hong Kong at that time was protesting against the CCP. So, the DPP won huge during 2020 election. Partly was the reason that the Taiwan residents were fed up with the kind of efforts by the Chinese government. In terms of the tech firms' response, I do think, they did a okay job, at least Meta, Microsoft, even TikTok, which is owned by the Chinese government. They took down disinformation campaign that they suspected came from the Chinese government, and they, kind of made it transparent that we did that. They also worked with like civil society groups to do fact checking. An example would be Line. I don't remember which organization. I think it was MyGoPen that worked with Line to create a chat box. So as a user of the messaging app Line, you saw a message and you don't know whether it's true or not, then you copy paste the message into the chat box. It will tell you, the background of this message was it's fact based or it's not accurate. Also, Facebook had for like information that spread very wide on Facebook, and it's not accurate, there will be a notification giving you the context. Anybody who were here during the last election knew how that looked like, how the social media company tried to play a role to contain the disinformation. But one big criticism with tech firms that I definitely share is that they do their part to contain disinformation, but they don't like regulations. They always say, we're gonna self-regulate our platforms, but they always resist regulations by the government, by legislations. I think this is a problem, and with all tech firms, they have a problem with transparency. Yes, they announced, we took down this and that campaigns, but to what extent it is happening, how much of that the companies are addressing, we don't know, just because there's no transparency. And when when governments wants to pass legislation, try to force company to be transparent, and they always resist. So I think that's a problem just beyond the Taiwan context. It's a tech company around the world. This is in the Taiwan election context in terms of Beijing's efforts in terms of the different actors that try to counter the disinformation. As we all know that the CCP didn't succeed entirely because the DPP was elected as someone they didn't want, but it didn't fail spectacularly because, you know, the legislature, DPP didn't win the legislative yuan. I think going forward, this information by the CCP will definitely continue. They will probably have more sophisticated ways of doing that. They will invest more in doing that. But I also foresee that there will be, more response from the civil society, from the government. So it's a cat and mouse game. As I said, this is based on a study we done pre the election, and go check out the Freedom House website. We give a very, very detailed context of how all the disinformation campaign happened in the larger efforts by Beijing over decades to shape the information environment in Taiwan. I think that's it. Thank you.
So thank you, Professor Jobing, for the kind introduction, and thank you, Seeger Center, for having me today. So a little bit about myself, that before my academic career, I worked as a communication specialist in several political campaigns in Taiwan. And last semester, during my sabbatical, I was actually in Taiwan for 6 months to observe the election up close. So I'm very happy and honored to be here today to have this opportunity to talk about a subject that is not only a scholarly research for me, but also a personal experience. So Director Wang has already provided a very comprehensive overview of the China's interference during the 2024 elections. I think I'm gonna use my time to dive into the dynamics of the 3 major political parties involved and the changing landscape of political politics in Taiwan. All right, so 2 months after the election, I think we are now all well informed of the outcomes of the election. Despite it being a tight, difficult 3-way race, Lai Ching-te of the DPP, along with his running mate Xiaobi Kim, was able to secure the presidency victoriously. I don't think a lot of people find this outcome surprising. And I think a lot of people read this outcome as Taiwan sending a clear message to China and its diplomatic allies. A lot of people would say that this is, again, a Taiwanese miracle, being able to resist external forces aiming to interfere Taiwan's politics, and also to safeguard democracy in Taiwan for the rest of the world. I think if you are following international coverage of the election, you'll be reading that kind of story a lot. That was a very popular framework used to frame the election outcomes. However, if we scrutinize a little bit closer to the numbers, perhaps we should approach the election outcomes with more caution rather than optimism. So why do I say that? Here is the election outcomes. Here are the numbers. So on the slides, you can see that DPP was able to win the presidency with 40% of the popular votes. KMT finished second, secured 33.5% of the votes. And then TPP was able to secure 26.5%. So it was indeed a very tight political race with 3 major political parties. I think the last time we saw this kind of 3-way race, meaningful 3-way race in Taiwan, was 2000. And that was the time between the 3 different political parties, DPP, KMT, and Kuomintang, People First Party. So this is like in 24 years, the very first time we are seeing a 3-way race in Taiwan. And in terms of the legislative yuan elections, unfortunately, DPP lost a lot of seats and lost its majority as well. KMT was able to gain 14 seats, and TPP was able to gain 3 more seats, and then grew from 5 to 8 right now. So if you look at the numbers, and if you look at this big picture, I would say all political parties are winners and losers in this time around. For DPP, Lai Ching-te was able to win the presidency. However, compared to Tsai Ing-wen's victories in 2016, where she was able to win 56% of the vote, And in 2020, she was able to win 57% of the vote. And that was also the time that DPP won the majority in the LY. So compared to Tsai Ing-wen's victory and compared to DPP's previous performances in LY, you would understand that Lai Ching-te would find himself in a much weaker position to lead and to advance DPP agenda in the next 4 years. We don't know what future holds for the country, but if this turned out to be a repeat of the Chen Shui-bian era in the 2000s, then I think we all need to brace ourselves for a lot of political theatrics and political idleness in the coming 4 years. In terms of KMT, despite losing the presidency for the 3rd time, which I believe is very disappointing for the party, KMT was able to control most of the votes this time in LY, not as the majority, but was able to control most of the seats. So that put them in a very good position to negotiate in terms of the direction of the in terms of the direction of the future policy in Taiwan. So I would still consider KMT as a winner in this election. And also I think this outcome attests to KMT's effectiveness to mobilize and to utilize grassroots organization. TPP, as this rising 3rd political force, of course, was the party that received most of the media attention during this election cycle. Despite finishing 3rd in the presidential election and losing all the legislative election in the local district, TPP was able to gain 3 more seats in LY and now controls 8 votes. And with neither KMT or DPP controls the majority, TPP now has successfully established itself as a crucial, critical swing vote in LY, and that will determine the passing of the legislation for the next 4 years. So once again, that's why I say each political party is a winner and a loser in this political season. And maybe that's exactly the wisdom of Taiwanese people. No one should win at all. So beyond this broad picture, what are some nuances that we are seeing, observing in terms of Taiwan's local politics and this changing political landscape? Let's start with TPP. So again, I already mentioned that TPP, this is a weak win for Lai Ching-te, this is a weak mandate. And I would also say that Lai Ching-te established his political career as this conventional male DPP politician. He is not Tsai Ing-wen in terms of he doesn't have a very political brand. And he also, in his earlier times, embraced this pro-Taiwan independence stance, this position. And this position could be easily weaponized by China to justify and to increase its aggression toward Taiwan. So I think what awaits Taiwan will be something very, very difficult. And this is where we put a lot of faith and hope in Xiaomi Qin, especially with her international connection and her diplomatic capacity. Over the years, serving as the representative to the US, Xiaomi Qin was able to forge meaningful international connections for Taiwan and to amplify Taiwan's global visibility. And we would hope that with Xiaomi Qin serve as the vice president, that would really help the Lai Ching-te administration to not only maintain peace cross strait, but also to fight against this diminishing international space for Taiwan. And what I would encourage everybody to pay close attention would be the inauguration speech on May 20th. What Lai Ching-te would going to say would be a key message, not only for China, for the international society as well. But beyond that, I think this is really the time for DPP to have that serious self-reflection on its position, on its branding, and on its engagement strategies. So DPP started in 1986 as this oppositional party, fighting against the dominance of KMT. It was a grassroots party, utilized street fighting tactics as a way to get support of the Taiwanese people. However, 3 decades after, DPP has already proven itself as a well-established political entity with aspiration for long-term governance. So how can DPP redefine itself as an inspirational governing party, not that's, street fighting party anymore, but an inspirational governing party? How can DPP effectively marketize itself to younger generations as a force of change, not just as part of the establishment? I think that would be crucial questions for DPP to answer, to find the path to reclaim the 3 million votes that it lost during this election season, despite winning the presidency. And for KMT, yes, as I mentioned earlier, KMT was able to increase its seats in Legislative Yuan, so congratulations, and also was able to secure 35% of the popular votes. However, I think, in all honesty, KMT is a party that is having an identity crisis. Knowing that most people in Taiwan now self-identify as Taiwanese, and knowing that most people in Taiwan now prefer to maintain status quo, KMT understand that it has to dial down that pro-China position to win the presidential election. And in fact, I think the nomination of Hou You-yi was a step into that direction. Hou You-yi, different from many KMT politicians, Hou You-yi is a Taiwanese. He's not a mainlander. He's actually more fluent in Taiwanese than Mandarin. So the nomination of Hou You-yi is a way for KMT to signify that it is ready to move that political pivot and to localize itself to some extent. However, knowing that they are not going to be able to form the joint ticket between KMT and TPP, that immediately KMT decided to nominate a vice candidate, Zhao Xiaokang, who represent this conventional majority in KMT. So Zhao Xiaokang as this like deep blue, hawkish political commentator, very China friendly. He joined the ticket and basically rewrite the rhetoric and policy. I mean, last year in October, when Hou You-yi visited DC, Brookings specifically, Hou You-yi was talking about his 3D strategy to maintain this cross-strait relations. It was deterrence, dialogue, and de-escalation. So if you really look into that, that was not that different from the Tsai Ing-wen approach. But right after Zhao Xiaokang joined the ticket, it went from 3D to 2D. They didn't even talk about a deterrence anymore. So KMT, despite all the effort, tried to localize itself through the nomination of Hou You-yi. It went back to the old trajectory. So moving forward, I think the most important thing for KMT to win the presidency, it is important for KMT to tell the Taiwanese people that it is more than just DPP haters, and to convince Taiwanese people that it is possible to engage with China while also maintaining Taiwan's democracy, dignity, and way of life. If KMT is able to answer those questions, I think they still have a shot in presidency. And finally, this rising star, Taiwan People's Party, TPP. So again, as I mentioned earlier, TPP through this election was able to establish itself as this critical minority. It is now the legislature's swing vote. TPP was a very new party. It was started in 2019 by then Taipei City Mayor Ko Wen-je. Ko Wen-je was trained as a physician, not a politician. So he joined he started his political journey in 2004 as this unconventional but DPP friendly politician. He was more green leaning in the beginning, but slowly over time, he evolved into this like blue leaning, China friendly politician and repeatedly emphasized two sides of the strait. One family, a phrase that is desired by CCP and Beijing. So his political position is confusing. It's very, very confusing to Taiwanese people. And I don't think we got a clear answer even after this election cycle. But Ko Wen-je, as a very ambitious politician, he was aiming to use this political election as a way to establish TPP as more than just a one-man's party, and it is a political force here to stay. And I think another thing to really pay attention to was their capacity to use innovative communication strategy and communication platforms, specifically TikTok. And he started a KPTV on YouTube. I think his usage of TikTok is really meaningful during this election season, because among the three candidates, I think Ko Wen-je was the only one who not only has a TikTok presence, but has more than 1 million followers. So he was able to use short form videos, TikTok as a major platform to engage the youth vote. While on the other hand, DPP saw TikTok as a national security issue. So they refused to even have presence on the account, which I also think is smart, because according to a report that I read by a Canadian think tank, TikTok basically banned everything that has anything to do with Lai Ching-te's election. If you type in Lai Ching-te as a keyword, you are not going to see anything other than conspiracy theories, nothing positive. So I think it was right for DPP to not engage TikTok, but by doing so, it is also conceding a meaningful platform to engage the younger generation. And I think this is a question beyond even the Taiwanese boundary. This is now a problem for democracies across the world. Here in the US, we are having that debate. We are having that struggle exact the same way. So how are we going to do this? How can we fix this? And beyond TikTok, is there an alternative platform that we can engage the younger generation? I think that's a crucial question for democracies across the world to answer. And Taiwan was just the very first to attempt to deal with that problem. So now TPP function as a swing vote in the legislature. It is very important to see how it is going to ally itself either with KMT or DPP. And if the House, the Speaker of Legislative Yuan give us any indication, I think it is more likely that TPP is going to work with KMT. So if you are following the Taiwanese news, in the beginning of February, we had a election of the new Speaker of the LY to welcome this new term of legislators. And before the election, there were speculations how three political parties might work together or work against each other. There were speculations that to have TPP support, that DPP was even willing to nominate Huang Shanshan as the Speaker of LY as a way to forge that coalition. And we saw that KMT was also extremely friendly toward TPP in a way to win their support. But at the end, the three political parties all nominated its candidates. So it was Han Kuo-yu, Liu Xi-kun, and Huang Shanshan. And at the end, each political parties voted along the the party line. So Han Kuo-yu was able to secure 54 votes, Liu Xi-kun 51, and of course, Han Kuo-yu won the election. And TPP, by voting itself, yes, it's a way to establish its political identity and neutrality, but it is also helping KMT in a more implicit way. So I think moving forward, we are not going to see a one package kind of deal in terms of the political coalition, but it is also more likely that TPP is going to work with KMT. So to conclude my presentation on the evolving political politics in Taiwan, I would suggest that all of us pay very close attention to this upcoming 2026 midterm election in Taiwan. So if you still remember in 2022, DPP faced yet another significant setback during that year. They were only able to secure 5 seats among 21 during that 9-in-1 election. So in 2 years, we are going to do that again, the midterm election. KMT is known for its grassroots organization, but this time around, TPP has already declared its intention to field candidates in every city during the midterm election. So with TPP now joining the picture, what are we going to see? Is TPP going to attract more voters from KMT, so benefiting the DPP? Or are we going to see in specific cities that KMT and TPP will forge coalition, so that would hurt DPP's opportunity in those regions? I think only time will reveal the answer. So this is my brief presentation on the changing political politics in Taiwan. I think I will wrap up my talk right now, and I will give it to Shelley.
All right, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here. And I think this panel was set up really beautifully, and these two presentations are complementing each other so nicely. And so we've had the kind of the big, not entirely global, but definitely regional picture of the influences on this election and how voters were trying to make sense of those influences. We've had the excellent kind of party by party analysis of the election and what it means. And so I'm going to back out even in that sort of in another direction to say something about some of the larger trends in public opinion, how they play in, and how they may help us make some sense of some of the more mysterious aspects of this particular election. I also just want to say that I have a personal bone to pick with Ko Wen-je for selecting a party name which will require all of us to articulate with extreme care for as long as the TPP and the DPP are coexisting in Taiwan's political space. So thanks a lot for that, Kopi. So the question that I was asked to talk about today is the question of national identity or identity and politics, and how that might play in a little bit in this year's election. And I don't think I'm going to be really saying anything that people in this room don't already know, because I recognize a lot of expertise in here. Always a little stressful. But I think maybe this will give you a way to talk about what you kind of instinctively or through your 10,000 hours of commitment to this topic already know. So one of the big surprises in this election was the success of the TPP, and in particular, Ko Wen-je as a presidential candidate, given that the presidential election is first past the post, right? So what we would expect in a presidential election that is that does not have any kind of runoff aspect to it is that people are going to abandon their preferred candidate in order to try to block their least preferred candidate. Voting between the lesser of two evils is a time-honored tradition in presidential systems. We do it every time in the United States, and we're up again this year for voting between the lesser of two evils. In the view of many people, personally, I have a strong preference and I love them, but abnormal, I will admit. So the fact that 22% of the voters went ahead and voted for a candidate who from the beginning appeared to have very little chance of winning, at the potential high cost to both of the other two candidates, because it's still not totally clear in the absence of Ko Wen-je how this election would have gone. The fact that 22% of the voters still threw away, right, wasted their votes on this kind of insurgent candidate is actually pretty interesting. And it's interesting in part because it doesn't fit with the kind of very, very, very standard narrative about Taiwanese politics, which is that at the end of the day, it always comes down to cross-strait relations and Taiwan's identity in the world, right? Identity, sovereignty, cross-strait relations, the sort of big who are we questions, on which the DPP and the KMT have a clear division in terms of their party image, even if their actual policy positions tend to diverge only minimally. But the voters understand what they're doing when they, on that issue, when they choose green or blue. And the TPP has a very, as Chao-ning has very well articulated, a vague and unstable position on that issue. So if national identity or that sort of package of concerns are what drives Taiwan politics, how did Ko Wen-je get 22% of the vote? So that's one mystery. Another mystery related to this is how did he get 22% of the vote? Probably with a very large share of the youth vote. Because another phenomenon that we have been observing for a long time is that young people are significantly, not entirely, but significantly driving the trend that is on the screen behind me, which is the trend toward identifying as Taiwanese only, rather than as Chinese only, or as both Taiwanese and Chinese. So we know that young people identify as Taiwanese by a very large margin. And we know that the DPP is the party that most strongly reflects that kind of identity and speaks to that most credibly. And yet, young voters seem to have broken disproportionately for the TPP. So this is an interesting set of mysteries. Identity, or national identity, specifically the answer to this question, are you Taiwanese, Chinese, or both, is often treated as a driver of an individual's willingness to kind of challenge Beijing's preferred position on cross-strait relations and Taiwan's identity, or even as a proxy for it. So a lot of times in popular media, you'll see something like, you know, young Taiwanese overwhelmingly identify as Taiwanese only, suggesting that they are somehow the strongest opponents of the PRC in Taiwan, because their identity, their partisanship, their feelings about China are all kind of aligned. And of course, if we follow that through to its kind of conventional wisdom terminus, their position on independence and unification is also implicated. The problem is that there is a very clear trend on identity. You know, so in the early 1990s, there were still people who called themselves Chinese only. Now they are down below the non-response category. But the both has also steadily declined, although not nearly as sharply as Taiwanese only. Yet, if we look at trends in independence and unification, we don't see the same kind of a strong trend. We see much more consistency in preferences. So this is such a complicated graph. I'll show you something much simpler in a second. But the independence ones are the green circles and the black circles. Unification are the shades of red. Status quo, either for now and think about it again later, or status quo forever, are blue and black triangles. And so you can see that support for unification has always been low and stays low. Support for immediate independence is also low and stays low over time. So how can you have two trends that are supposedly measuring sort of the same impulse in an individual, and one has a strong trend and the other does not? It's clearly something interesting going on here. Here's another way to think about the preference for independence versus unification. This is from a survey that I did with some colleagues, Lev Nachman, Nathan Chan, and John Mock back in May of 2021. And we asked people, if 0 is immediate independence and 10 is immediate unification, where do you put yourself? And a plurality, a large plurality, put themselves at 5. We can see that there is a stronger, if 5 were a fulcrum, this graph would tilt toward independence a little bit, but we don't see polarization, and we don't see a lot of enthusiasm for immediate independence as well. So again, identity is changing, but it does not translate into a strong trend in favor of what many Western observers, and a lot of people in Taiwan too, assume to be the kind of logical policy manifestation of that identity. So what is going on? So this is a breakdown of national identity by age, and it shows that indeed the trend is that the younger generations, and this is also from that 2021 survey that we did, the younger age decile, so I'm not going to say generation, but the younger age cohorts are the most Taiwanese identified, and the older age cohorts are the most likely to identify as both, with very low in any age cohort identifying as Chinese. But preference for independence unification is not as clear, especially across the younger age cohorts. So this is the mean score on that 0 to 10 of the age cohorts. So a low score is a pro-independence score. So we see the 30 to 39 having the most pro-independence, with the 20 to 29 actually being a little bit less pro-independence, at least in this survey. So one thing I think we might want to take away from these two, right, is that for the youngest Taiwanese voters, the ones who we believe were swayed by the Ko-en-je message, the political preference across unification versus independence is less determined by identity than it has been in the past, or than it is for older generations. I'm also thinking about, this is the 10th anniversary of the sunflower movement. Like 10 years ago today, they were actually occupying the legislature. And I'm thinking about how these 20 to 29-year-olds, they sort of bridge the sunflower generation. So some of them are old enough to have been really actively engaged in sunflower and the sort of youth movement around it. But many of them were actually too young to have been involved. If you're 20 years old in 2021, you were in middle school during sunflower. So there may be a little bit of a post-sunflower effect here as well. I'm just, that's a hypothesis or a point of curiosity, not a claim that I'm making. So young people seem not necessarily to draw a strong political or partisan conclusion out of their identity preference, or identity is not a preference, right? Out of their identity. And youth are not necessarily the most pro-independence age cohort in Taiwan. So on the one hand, if we go back here, we see that Taiwan independence is not super popular, at least not in the sense of like, let's do it now, let's start tomorrow, which is what the 0 would suggest. But unification is even less popular. So how can we introduce that dimension? And here, I think it would be advisable for us to maybe refocus a little bit away from always looking at identity as the driver and the predictor of how a Taiwanese person of any generation or age is going to feel about mainland China, going to feel about the PRC, and shift our attention toward the PRC, which is itself absolutely every day across many domains, as we have, as not professor, but actually much more high impact person at doing this work out in the trenches for us. Wang, that's your long title, has pointed out, Beijing is in every way, every day across many domains, influencing the perceptions of Taiwanese people, young and old, but especially young because of these social media practices. And that influence is pretty negative. So on the question we asked, is the Chinese government a friend or enemy of Taiwan? Only the 60 plus, the oldest age cohort, was willing to say friend above neither friend nor enemy. But in all of the other age cohorts, a majority says enemy. And the last set is the sample overall. So in our sample overall, 72% said the Chinese government, right? The PRC government, not the PRC people, not China as an abstract concept of historical or cultural significance, but the PRC government is an enemy of Taiwan, and the PRC's impact on Taiwan they assess to be negative. So I suspect that we are seeing as much the repercussions of Beijing's actions, both external and internal, because Taiwanese are also very aware of what it is like in the PRC today, the level of repression, the level of the kind of economic changes that are working against Taiwanese investors and also working against PRC private companies and so on. Both the external and the internal actions of the Chinese Communist Party leadership, I think, are an important driver of sentiment and preferences in Taiwan. So I guess I was asked to speak about identity, and so I did. But I hope that we're losing variation on one of our independent variables. When 90% of people say they're Taiwanese only, how does that actually become meaningfully correlatable with anything else? So what else can we look to besides identity to explain political preferences and behavior? Well, I think one possible variable to look to would be what Taiwanese are seeing from the mainland, both within the mainland and how it affects Taiwan, and actually how it affects the rest of the world, is a place to start. Thank you.
Thank you to all three our wonderful speakers with such energy and insights. In fact, I think this wraps up the three papers really well in terms of the survey results of identification issues and how different parties, as our speakers have touched on, would manipulate these ideologies of what they say versus what they do in order to win votes. And I think there are plenty of overlaps among the three papers. I will save my own questions for later in preference to people who are actually here. I'm sure have comments and questions. So please feel free to raise your hand, and remember, turn on your mic. Yes, please.
I'm Peter Humphrey, an intelligence analyst and a former diplomat. I'm looking to the far future and wondering if, by some miracle, PRC goes through its Gorbachev-Yeltsin phase and the party actually ends up disintegrating, whether Taiwan would automatically embrace mainland China and try and create a unified nation under a freer regime, or whether it's gone so far now that Taiwan is, for all intents and purposes, for the next century, an independent country.
Excellent. Which one of you would like to take this on? Taiwan. Every time they talk about independence, I have the same question too. Hasn't Taiwan been an independent country? In terms of a sovereign state. And so when I talk about pro-independence, rather peculiar.
Is this on? Yeah.
Yes.
In all honesty, I don't think I can have a definite answer to that. That is a picture that is almost unimaginable. I don't think in Taiwan we have had that conversation so far. It's just such an impossible picture. So yeah, I don't know. How do you feel, Shelley?
Yeah, I think it feels pretty unlikely. And the credibility of the PRC state is so radically eroded. And, you know, the Soviet Union went through its Gorbachev era and is now violently assaulting its neighboring countries that it imagines to be part of its, you know, rightful empire. So the sort of global environment for giving anybody in that, any nation in that situation, the benefit of the doubt, is certainly not present at the moment. At the same time, though, I think the Taiwanese voters are highly pragmatic, actually, given the sort of heightened ideological climate around many issues promoted over the course of Taiwan's democratization. The fact that the center of gravity has been so strong, you know, that many people give independence and unification a 5 suggests that we should not rule out possible futures if they make pragmatic sense, even if they feel wildly out of alignment with the kind of emotional or ideological vibe of the moment.
Please.
I want to make a quick comment, even though I'm not on the panel and that question wasn't directed at me, but my colleagues in Taiwan have written an article that may help to answer this partly. So this is based on a question from the Taiwan National Security Study based at Duke. And the question was, if China's political, economic, and social conditions become more similar to those in Taiwan, would you support Taiwan's unification with China? Even under those conditions, the proportion who said they would support unification was less than half of the ones who said they would not support unification, even under the most ideal of circumstances on the other side of the Taiwan Strait.
So it's not merely a choice of ways of life, political system. Even if political systems were to be similar, right?
One question primarily to Chao-Ning and Shelley about predicting the future, which, as Yogi Berra says, is much harder than predicting the past. So how should we understand this? I mean, mostly to Chao-Ning, third parties in Taiwan don't have a very strong history, right? We have one-person parties, yes, one leader, whether it's Song Chu-yu or Li Danghui or whomever, and they tend to flame out pretty quickly. But they also tend to have been fringe parties like Deep Green or Deep Blue. PPP is rather different. It's a one-man party, but it's kind of at the ideological center, and there may be a generational story. So if you had to sort of say whether that past experience of failed third parties projects trouble for Clippy or whether it's going to go forward. And for Shelley, it seems to me you're telling kind of a almost generational formation of age cohort formation of political views, right? I mean, this is not people age into conservatism or something like that. It really sounds like they had these formative moments. And so the older generations were formed at a moment when nobody thought the status quo was viable. You had to head one way or another. And I wonder what the future looks like if we do see greater pressure on the status quo, particularly from China.
Right. So I grew up in Taiwan, and I personally witnessed those rise and fall of political parties, Xingdang being one example, and then Qimingdang being another. So Minzhongdang, TPP this time, it was surprising, but also not that surprising. I think for TPP to establish it as a sustainable political party, they really need to work on beyond just communication strategies. And, they are very good with marketizing itself, but what about grassroots organization? I think those are key component to win local elections. So that's why I suggest to pay very close attention to the upcoming midterm election. But I would like to also see DPP, the rise of DPP, TPP as an opportunity for DPP to do some soul searching. I really feel very strongly about it. I was in Taiwan during my sabbatical, and I gave a few talks at universities, and I was reminded by the professors again and again that, oh, you want to be more, subtle with your language because most of the students here are Kepi supporters. And I was a little bit confused by that. And then the professor reminded me, like, you have to imagine that their generation, they grew up with the DPP governance. For them, DPP is the establishment. So to vote for someone else is a way to claim their identity and their pursuit of innovation. And so I think DPP really has to find a way to balance this aspiration of long-term governance, but also retell the story that it can still be a force of change. And how do you maintain that balance? I think that will be the major issue for DPP. Yeah.
I think those are all fantastic points. I would just add that TPP can still totally blow it by falling into all of the other toxic patterns that the other third parties that you're talking about have fallen into. Infighting. So you have two big personalities in the TPP, Ko Wen-je, who lost his race, Huang Shanshan, who won her race, and also Huang Guocheng. Well, we can say, I think with high certainty that he will not last in any organization that requires, collaboration and subjugating your ego to someone else's. So they could fall apart because they can't get along with each other anymore, and they're arguing about who's the real, future of the party. And then they could also fall apart by not taking advantage of the opportunity they have been given by the voters to show their commitment to governing. If they decide to be an obstructionist force in the legislature and refuse to take positions on issues that you said idleness and theatrics and idleness. If they choose theatrics and idleness over governing, I don't think the electorate is going to reward them for that. So in some ways, be careful what you wish for. If you're the kingmaker in the legislature, then people actually expect you to carry the crown around. And if you think that this position is just like, I don't have to be responsible for anything because I'm not one of the big parties, that's how you lose the crown. As far as what happens with greater pressure on the status quo, as long as there is pretty high confidence within Taiwan that one, the PRC is not actually going to make a move militarily, and two, if the PRC did make a move militarily, that Taiwan would be able to survive with sustainable, survivable damage, then I think pressure on the status quo just increases resistance to the PRC's preferred positions. But I do not have confidence that if it became widely believed, so if many people or most people believed that the PRC was actually serious about using military force, and that Taiwan's ability to resist the kind of damage that we're now seeing in places like Ukraine and Gaza, I'm not ready to stake my money on we'll try our luck with the military solution, right? So I don't think we can count on Taiwanese always being ready to resist, given the enormous consequences of refusing the final offer from Beijing.
I think that's why, like the research done by Director Wang and Freedom House, the rise of America's skepticism in Taiwan is particularly dangerous. It is exactly that kind of narrative that would make Taiwanese people lose confidence in its allies, and then surrender to the Chinese aggression, to not believe that the US would come and defend, to have doubts in the support that we would get from international allies, would put us in a position that maybe eventually we will bow to that Chinese aggression.
All right, we have next question, please.
Hi, my name's Oma Baron, and I'm an intern at the Global Taiwan Institute. And I had a question regarding the TPP because Ethan Tu from Taiwan AI Labs, when they were looking at PRC election efforts on TikTok, they were surprised to find that efforts on TikTok were really focused on pushing pro-Ko-Wen-je narratives. And I was wondering what the panel thought about this and why PRC efforts on TikTok were particularly focused on really pushing pro-Ko-Wen-je material.
Should I take that out? Got you.
Tell me more about the study. I didn't see.
Sure. I mean, just off the top of my head, Taiwan AI Labs was tracking sort of PRC efforts on social media. So it was TikTok, Twitter, and Facebook. But most specifically on TikTok, they found that PRC efforts were focused on pushing narratives that were pro-Ko-Wen-je and pro-TPP over efforts to push pro-KMT. They were more widespread than efforts to push whole and the KMT, which they found was surprising on TikTok. And so I was just wondering if that you had any thoughts on that.
I haven't seen a study, but I'm just wondering how do they know the CCP is behind it, or how do they actually measure? Because the algorithm, what content they suppress and promote is all it's not transparent. So it's hard to know how actually things happened. So this is one. The other is why they are promoting Ko-Wen-je, assuming that it's actually happened. I mean, I don't know. I mean, they had an agenda, obviously, to they don't hope DPP to win. So I don't exactly know, but I understand, promoting Ko-Wen-je in that way, it could be a strategy to, I don't know, dampen the support for DPP. I think I really wanted to know exactly how the study was done, how they could make the conclusion that whether the CCP was involved, even besides whether the CCP is involved, how can they know that TikTok, the company, is doing that rather than the algorithm made this happen, or some other factors that are beyond the company's control?
Yeah, sorry. To be clear, it wasn't TikTok itself. It was bots and bot accounts on TikTok that were sort of flooding TikTok, and that's how they presented it. Rather than it being like TikTok, the app itself, it was more users and bot videos that were being pushed. If that helps with clarification.
I see. I don't actually know why they chose this strategy. So yeah, sorry. Okay. Do you guys have any idea? Theories?
I think I read a report published by AI Lab, and I think it went through different stages before that, it was proven that TPP and KMT was not able to form a joint ticket. I think there were narratives on TikTok really promoting Ko-Wen-je, but then after that fell apart, I think that the narrative shifted to Hou You-yi. So I agree with Director Wang. It was really hard to say who is behind this. But then if we see, TikTok as a platform very much governed by a company established in China, and therefore their governance and algorithm, maybe China was behind us, and maybe they are promoting a candidate that has the best shot to win against Lai Ching-te.
Yes, please.
I'm a elite school student. I'm from China. I'm Chinese. I'm not a Taiwanese. DPP won presidential election of multiple reasons. One of the reason is outside the island reason. Like 2020, Taiwan won presidential election because Hong Kong and brave movement, Hong Kong situation caused Taiwanese people choose Taiwan, choose DPP. But in this election, Russian invasion Ukraine awake Taiwanese. This is an international reason. I think this is very critical because presidential election is different Congress, different legislature. Legislature focus on local policy. Legislature focus on defense, diplomacy. So I think Taiwanese people like choose a tough guy or strong man like Zelensky. So they choose DPP Lai Ching-te. Do you think my opinion is correct, and do you think international reason affect this election? Okay.
It's hard to say, how different factors play in. At the same time, though, I think many of us assess that you're certainly right about 2020, that the Hong Kong crisis affected the Taiwan election a lot. I would argue that the Ukraine war is very hard for Taiwanese voters to interpret what that means for them and how to vote in response to it. That became implicitly a part of the campaign when the blue camp, especially KMT, but I think Ko-wen-je also kind of leaned on this kind of thinking, the idea that challenging the PRC is dangerous, right? So a vote for the DPP is a vote for war. So one way to interpret the war in Ukraine is the way to avoid that is to not offend our neighbor. And there definitely are even politicians in Taiwan who take that position, that the reason Ukraine got invaded was because the Ukrainians were baiting, right, Russia. The first I ever learned in detail Putin's argument for invading Ukraine, his kind of racial and imperial and Nazi referencing argument for why he had to invade Ukraine was actually in a video created by a Taiwanese local council politician. So there is an audience that says, we should not make the same mistake as Ukraine. But then there's also plenty of Taiwanese who look at Ukraine and say, okay, we don't want that to happen to us, so we need to be militarily strong enough to deter that. And I don't know how those two interpretations, as well as all the other ways that people could either not notice, care, or care in another way about Ukraine, actually break down. But I do think that the campaign, in the way that the candidates talked about war and peace, suggests that you can make the argument either way and it will find a receptive audience.
One final question. Yes.
Thanks very much for the presentations. I'm Mike Fonte. I work for the DPP here in town, so I'll ask a DPP type question. But first I want to make a point for all of our friends in the DPP elsewhere. That is, the skepticism towards the United States, I think, ought to be toned down significantly. President Biden 4 times now has said we would be there, the United States would be there if there was an unprovoked attack by the Chinese. That's within the one China policy framework. And the Biden administration has a great deal of work building on what's called a lattice work of deterrence by getting other countries to say peace and stability is very important to them. So I think that's something that we ought to keep in mind. But my other question, I guess, Xiaoning, you could deal with this. The problem, one of the biggest problems, it seems to me, that created the youth vote for the TPP were governance problems. Whole question of cost of housing, inequality, lack of wage growth, et cetera. And it seems to me that's going to be key when the LY gets to do its work, right? Will the TPP meet those issues with the DPP? How is that going to work? And I guess that's a question to you, how you see that breaking in this coming period.
I think that will be case by case. I think it will be policy by policy. As I mentioned earlier, I don't think that will be a one package kind of deal between TPP and DPP. I think it will be very much case by case, policy by policy. And as we get closer to the midterm election, for TPP to get the support and the media attention, I think they will be quite selective on some policy issues. They may work with DPP just so that they can garner more votes. And on some policy issues, they may choose to work against DPP just to make a stance or just to, express their position. So I think it's hard to say. And I still think it's going to be case by case. I don't think we will see an agreement that we are going to hold hands and then work together from now on. I think it will be rather selective. And I think it would change over time as well.
Excellent, thank you. And we are at time. Lunch awaits and invite us all to continue this lively conversation and have afternoon session as well. Let's thank our panelists. Thank you very much. And thank you for joining us.
Yeah, this is what. Take a second to find your seats. And you can continue eating your lunch because I know some of you were, especially the speakers, were otherwise detained by others after lunch, after the talk. Okay, good afternoon. My name is Deepa Olapalli. I'm the Associate Director of the Seeger Center and a Research Professor of International Affairs. And it's my real great pleasure to introduce the second panel to you. I think we had a terrific first session. And in fact, I think they did it so well that they started stepping into the second session, which I'm happy to hear. And maybe we'll call you back up here as well. So the first session, the way I had organized it is that the first part would be on more of the domestic issues, and then second part on the external and international aspects of Taiwan and the new leadership going forward. But obviously, there are a great deal of linkages between the two. And what we're going to do is I'm going to start off with, let me introduce all of the speakers at once. And as we did before, they'll each get about 12 to 15 minutes to give their comments, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So first off, we're going to start with Dr. Jennifer Cavanaugh, who's a senior fellow at the American Statecraft Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And she is a political scientist. She spent a lot of her career studying national security threats and their consequences for US and defense strategy. Her focus has been right now on contemporary geopolitics with concentration on relationships between major powers, which are, you can guess, US, European Union, Russia, and China. And she has been also before at the Carnegie, she was a political scientist at the Rand Corporation, where she led projects on deterrence, military interventions, and US military posture for defense and national security clients. She's done a lot of thinking, I know, on cross-strait relations recently and talked at various conferences and so on.
She is also a term member of the Council on Foreign Relations and an adjunct professor in the Security Studies program at Georgetown University. I won't hold that against you for today. She's going to be talking on what her outlook is on cross-strait relations in this new political dispensation, I should say, a political landscape since the DPP is back in power. Following Jennifer, I'll turn to James Lee, who is an assistant research professor at the Institute for European and American Studies at Academia Sinica, which is the National Academy of Taiwan. He, in fact, just arrived from Taiwan, I think last night or something. So, but he looks in pretty good shape, so I think he's all set. He has a PhD in politics from Princeton University. He previously held research positions at universities in Florence, in San Diego, and also NATO Defense College in Rome. But I want to flag one thing out from his background to you, and that his research in strategic studies, he has a focus on US foreign policy and the security of Taiwan, and he is one of the principal investigators on something called the American Portrait Project, which is an annual survey of public opinion in Taiwan on US-Taiwan relations, which is why he jumped in with a intervention in the first panel on, I think, from that findings. He is going to be talking about directions in US-Taiwan ties moving forward. And we're going to round it off with Jacques Delisle, who's coming here from University of Pennsylvania. He's a chaired professor of law. He's also the director of Center for the Study of Contemporary China there. And he has done, his career has focused a lot on the international status of Taiwan and cross-strait relations, China's engagement with the international order, and US-China relations. He's also a director at the Asia program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. So we have three really distinguished panelists who are extremely well equipped to talk about where they think the new political dispensation is going to take Taiwan in its external environment. And so with that, oh yes, and Jacques is going to be talking about Taiwan's international reach and space and what the prospects are for that. So with that, let me ask Jennifer if you want to, she said she has no PowerPoint, so.
I have no PowerPoint. I apologize.
Just power.
Disappointing.
There you go.
Just power, yes.
Okay.
You'll be forced to look at my face the whole time. It's unfortunate. All right, thank you very much for having me. So I was asked to talk about cross-strait relations and Taiwan security. And I want to start with the potentially controversial assertion that from a security standpoint, the recent election in Taiwan was really a status quo election. Most of the candidates had sort of similar ideas about what Taiwan's defense strategy should be. Lai's proposed policies look very much like Tsai's. He hasn't proposed any major changes, and Beijing sort of held its main line, right? Reunification is inevitable. We prefer peaceful means, but are not ruling out military measures if necessary. And those positions pretty much held throughout the election and afterwards. The statements that Beijing put out after the election did not indicate any major changes in their strategy or approach to Taiwan. So from this standpoint, the fundamentals don't change. And I think it is, I can say with some confidence that I don't think the election changes Beijing's timeline. I don't think it moves it up. I don't think it moves it back. I don't think it changes their basic assessment of the situation or makes military force more or less likely. But I do still think that the election could be a pivot point in Taiwan's security. And I want to spend my remarks talking about why from each of the three major actors here, China, Taiwan, and then a little bit about the United States. Most of the focus in the US discussion about cross-strait relations is about the potential for a Chinese invasion, an amphibious invasion of Taiwan, and sometimes a blockade, mostly though kinetic blockade that would involve military fires as well.
But I think the most likely course of action probably is neither one of those. And it's more of a continuation of what we are currently seeing at a higher level, which is this gradual low intensity campaign of cross-domain interdiction of Taiwan's air, maritime, information, diplomatic, and economic space. So I think the most likely outcome over the next couple of months, and especially after May, when Lai is officially in his new position, is sort of similar to what we saw after the Pelosi visit in August of 2022, which is a pretty significant increase in the level and the intensity of these activities that sets a new status quo, which is basically what they did after the Pelosi visit. So we should expect then for Beijing to ramp up these types of low-level activities. And the goal, in my view, is not to weaken Taiwan or to make a future invasion easier, but rather a sort of different approach, which is to just gradually subsume Taiwan's autonomy, to take over and usurp its control over its airspace, its water space, its ability to control its economic fate, its diplomatic ties with other countries, its information space, its infrastructure. And over time, that becomes sort of suffocating and can lead to Taiwan being sort of paralyzed and unable to have sort of any sort of flexibility in maneuver. Potentially, that still leaves the door open for an invasion, but it also gives Beijing a lot of what it wants without having to use military force. We've already seen a lot of these activities, so a lot of this isn't new. We've seen China using their aircraft and their ships crossing over the median line in increasing amounts and number of times. Military exercises that are longer and more intense and bridge into Taiwan's territorial waters, information campaigns, economic pressure. And so I think since the election, we've already seen some intensification and some new activities, changing flight plans, some of the law enforcement activities around Kinmen Islands, announcement of reimposition of some tariffs. I guess that was in December, but coming up sort of around the same time, the boarding of the civilian tourist vessel. So we've already seen them sort of starting to branch into new spaces. And I think that will continue with things like potentially cutting off internet access intermittently, increased disinformation and cyber attacks. There's a lot they can do with their Coast Guard without even having to use their military. So law enforcement type activities, health inspections, safety inspections of ships, law enforcement activities in waters are usually controlled by Taiwan. Cuts to power or other types of pressure on infrastructure, new economic measures such as revoking economic cooperation agreements or increasing the number of goods that are no longer free from tariffs, and then diplomatic pressure, which we've already seen some, and which I assume my co-panelists will talk about in the context of the international space, but trying to flip Taiwan's partners. Now that doesn't, a lot of Taiwan's partners are already unofficial, so that may not have a huge impact, but I think it is sort of like a psychological impact. So all of these types of activities can look and feel sort of like a slow motion invasion or a non-traditional type of blockade that basically just cuts Taiwan off from the rest of the world. And so I think that, we should expect to see this type of ramp up, and Beijing will look for any sort of opportunity to justify that ramp up. And I think after May, we could potentially see that, and we should be watching for that. So if that's the China side of this weakening or potentially new vulnerabilities for Taiwan's security, what's the Taiwan side? So Lai has in the campaign and in a Wall Street Journal editorial laid out his defense strategy, which looked very much like Tsai's plans to continue to invest in the asymmetric defense strategy, to increase the time and intensity of the conscription period, to continue to work with close ties with the United States. So all of that sort of is very much status quo in terms of what was already happening. But at the same time, in the US, there was a narrative that this election was all about cross-state relations. But as we heard from our panelists this morning and as others have pointed out, that, that's not what people on the ground were thinking about or voting about. So Lai's going to come into office having to fulfill not only this defense side, but also a whole range of domestic issues that he'll have to deal with, because that's really where the political vulnerability will lie, is on his ability to address the social and domestic issues that people are voting on, and that were, cleared in the dissatisfaction that some of the younger generations, that polling data was really fascinating. So, so I think we see that coming up. So on the Taiwan side, if the defense investments that have to be made to implement a porcupine strategy or an asymmetric strategy, this strategy that involves lots of small things like air defense and mines, anti-ship missiles, those investments have to be made now because timelines are long. So you can buy them from the US, but they're not going to arrive for probably, 5 years if you're lucky. You can try to build a defense industrial base. That's also going to take time. So the investments have to be made now to have them in, say, 5 years. So delays are really costly, not just like exponentially costly. So at the same time as these investments really need to be made to protect Taiwan's security in the near term and the longer term, the government is going to be facing a lot of pressure to deliver on social and domestic issues. And the budget, there's only so much money. So I think that there's a potential here for trade-offs to be made. And you already see that a little bit, I think, in some of the weakening around Lai's commitment to having the longer conscription period, and whether or not defense spending can stay at sort of this higher level that they've gotten to, which in my opinion is still too low. So there's gonna have to be trade-offs. And I think there are vulnerabilities there because we know that just from the US context as well, politics often rules the day, and politicians will make the decision that can keep them in office if that's what's necessary, rather than sometimes the decision that would be better for sort of like long-term security interests. And so I think that those trade-offs will be tricky and could potentially open up new vulnerabilities. And add that to the fact that, this campaign that Beijing is likely to impose, this sort of, dark gray zone coercion. So gray zone, for those who aren't familiar, is like a military term for like activities between peace and war. So by dark gray zone, I mean like in that zone, but closer to the coercive side. Those types of activities are really hard to counter, even for like a well-prepared military. Because how do you respond to something that's not really military, but is quite coercive? You can't really use military force without escalating the situation and making it worse. So Taiwan's facing this really tough challenge of responding to these gray zone activities, and is forced to grapple with this defense budget issue. And I think those two things together put Taiwan in a, I think I said Beijing, but I meant Taiwan, put Taiwan in a very difficult situation. And it's quite exhausting and resource consuming to deal with the constant coercive activities. And I think the evidence of that is in the way Taiwan has shifted its response to Beijing's air incursions, right? It's no longer trying to track every single one of them or scramble its jets to every single one because it's just too exhausting. And it's not, that just doesn't just happen to Taiwan. Japan has had the same problem. So what about the third actor here, which came up a little bit in the last panel, which is the United States? Responding to these types of gray zone activities is just as hard for the United States as it is for Taiwan. In fact, it's even more so in some ways because of the difficulties and challenges in the US-China relationship, and also the really dangerous potential of escalation to a war between the United States and China, and the nuclear implications that come from that. Escalation spirals can happen quickly and at times that we don't expect, and so I think that's something that's always kind of looming in the background when you think about the U.S. responding militarily in this region. And the U.S. has always talks about responding with its allies and partners. In these gray zone activities, it's really hard to rally a coalition, because no one is really directly affected. If trade is still flowing to the Taiwan Strait, a lot of the rest of the region is likely to sit out and not want to be involved. So how do you build a coalition to work with the US and Taiwan to help counter this type of coercion? That's a very difficult challenge in the best of times, And then on top of that, you have the US election, which means that any US president is going to be very hesitant to do anything that causes a third conflict that they would have to get involved in. So Biden is facing not only this political challenge, but also like a material challenge of just not having enough stuff, already being committed in the Middle East and already being committed to Ukraine. There's added incentive to keep things quiet in the region, and that will complicate any response to this type of gray zone activity. So there's a number of challenges here from all three of the actors that I think create a number of risks and challenges in terms of how best to respond to what is likely to be an increasing coercion in the Taiwan Strait over the next year. So just to summarize sort of like where that leaves us, even though the fundamentals are the same, I think the risk level goes up because Beijing is likely to use this as an excuse to use gray zone coercion. Taiwan will face a number of challenges and its leadership will be forced to make trade-offs between the domestic and the defense sides. And the United States will face a number of challenges in its own response, materially, politically, and in terms of controlling escalation. So what can the United States and Taiwan do? Well, I think there's a number of things, and I would start with the point that we focus, at least in the United States in the military context, a lot on building deterrence, like restoring deterrence, maintaining deterrence. But I think that the focus should be just as strong on increasing resilience and increasing Taiwan's resilience in a number of ways. The first point would be making steady changes, not sudden changes. Sudden changes to anything are disruptive and destabilizing. So thinking about steady changes, slow changes that last a long time. The second point would be thinking about diversity of changes, not just focusing on the military. In the United States, we are very focused on the military and we often forget about the other domains. Those other domains are incredibly important to Taiwan's resilience, though. It's not just about defense. And the final thing would be, focusing on the low end things, not just the high end. And I'm not convinced. Some people argue that if you prepare for an invasion, you're preparing for these gray zone activities. I'm not convinced about that because I think the capabilities you need and the strategies you take aren't the same. And so I do think there has to be a specialized focus on these low level activities. So what might that look like? I do think that in the defense domain, the asymmetric approach is the right one. Investing in low cost, lots of low cost things like drones, sea mines. I have an article today in War on the Rocks on how Taiwan could use sea mines. So if you're interested in sea mines, it's a small group, I know, but if you're interested in sea mines, you should check out the article. And really, the longer conscription period is hugely important, I think, just in terms of the role that Taiwan's ground forces can play and sort of show like a sign of resolve, and making sure that defense spending remains, substantial. I understand there are trade-offs. I think it came up a little bit in the last panel, this idea that if Taiwan is concerned about US resolve, there might be a willingness to give in or compromise with Beijing in a way that they wouldn't if they thought the US would come. And I would say that the same functions on the US side. The US willingness to support Taiwan is going to be partly determined on the sense that Taiwan is ready to fight for itself. And I think you see that in the Ukraine context, where one of the big arguments in favor of continuing aid to Ukraine is how hard Ukraine has fought for its own independence compared to, say, the perception of Afghanistan and Iraq, where the will to fight didn't seem as strong. So I think having that defense spending and making those commitments is a way to help maintain the US support. I will say that even with US support, a US-China war is going to be over Taiwan is going to be very costly to everybody. So I think we should try to avoid it. But I think that's not a controversial statement. So on the defense side, on the domestic side, I actually think domestic spending is really important to this idea of resilience. It's the security of Taiwan really does depend, I think, on the domestic spending. In addition, not just the military spending. And that would include things like building stockpiles of food and fuel and other types of investments. I think infrastructure investment, cyber, getting an alternative to Starlink. So there's like secure internet that's not controlled by Elon Musk. Building up the infrastructure on the eastern side of the island, I think would be a very valuable investment because it will be a lot easier for outside forces to help resupply Taiwan and support Taiwan through those ports if they were built up to handle that. And then finally, this idea of coalition building and thinking about non-traditional partners. Whether, let's assume for the sake of argument here that I agree with the comment before that, Biden has said a number of times that the United States would be there. And I guess the political future of the United States is also uncertain, but Trump has made comments on all sides of the map, so I don't think we can predict on that. But it can't just be the US. It should be allies and partners across the region, but we also look for other partners. So Europe is a great example. Europe really wants to be involved. I don't think they have military assets to offer. They think they have military assets to offer, but I think their efforts could be much better channeled into things like helping with the cyber domain. So helping with the cyber coercion, helping with the economic aspect. And then the other place I think to look for partners is outside of governments, thinking about industry, like in the maritime space, working with shipping companies, and trying to build out a much more robust network of partners willing to work with Taiwan, not just other nations and outside of the Indo-Pacific, but into the commercial space where actors are motivated by a different set of factors, and there may be space to play there. So I will stop there and look forward to questions when we get to me.
Great. Thank you all so much for coming. Can you all hear me okay? Is the microphone working?
Should be on.
Test. You have to really walk into it. Okay. All right. All right, I'll try to project a little more since the microphone isn't quite picking up. Okay, so I'm going to talk about where I see the future direction of US-Taiwan relations and where I see the sources of stability and instability in the cross-strait security situation. But first, by kind of taking a historical perspective, drawing on a current debate in foreign affairs on how to implement deterrence in the Taiwan Strait. And so this debate unfolding in foreign affairs, and there's been recent CSIS poll on this as well, kind of goes back to Thomas Schelling's concept of deterrence as involving both threats and assurances. And the argument is, according to some scholars, that if the United States wants to deter China from using force against Taiwan, it needs to not only threaten to impose costs on Beijing by threatening to use military force in the event of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, but also to reassure Beijing that if Beijing doesn't use military force, the cost Beijing incurs will not be greater through Taiwan becoming independent. But generally, the concept is that deterrence is a kind of coercive diplomacy that involves both threats and assurances. So why is this more difficult to implement in practice than it is in theory? And so my perspective on this is that under the United States One China policy, its threats and assurances towards Beijing are encoded in three terms. Beijing's, quote, peaceful approach to cross-strait differences, the United States, quote, unofficial relations with Taiwan, and the United States opposition to unilateral changes in the, quote, status quo. So this explain more how this works in the One China policy. The term peaceful. The threat is that the United States reserves the right, but not the obligation, to play a direct role in Taiwan's defense if China does not use peaceful means for addressing cross-strait differences. The assurance is that if China does use peaceful means for addressing cross-strait differences, the United States will not play a direct role in Taiwan's defense. Unofficial. The assurance from the United States to China is that in this context, the United States will maintain, quote, unofficial relations with Taiwan. And the term status quo is also encoded with threats and assurances. The threat is that the United States opposes any attempt by Beijing to change the status quo unilaterally. The assurance is that the United States also opposes any attempt by Taiwan to change the status quo unilaterally. So the theory of deterrence involving both threats and assurances is an academic theory, and how it gets implemented in terms of United States policy is through these three key terms. The problem, as I see it, is that Washington and Beijing never agreed on what those terms actually mean. And what we're seeing is that as China's power has been growing, it's been challenging the United States and asserting its own definition of these terms. But the fact that they never agreed what these terms actually meant is why this bargain is starting to unravel. So the aspect of this that I want to focus on is the idea of the status quo, because the status quo is one of the kind of foundational concepts of underlying US policy toward Taiwan. So China, as we all know, asserts the one China principle as its interpretation of the status quo. But the United States does not agree with China's interpretation of the status quo. Under the Shanghai Communique, the United States said that, quote, the United States government will not challenge that position. So practically speaking, it means that the US doesn't publicly clarify its true position on Taiwan sovereignty, which is that Taiwan sovereignty has been undetermined, that Japan surrendered sovereignty over Taiwan after the San Francisco Peace Treaty, but Japan never formally transferred sovereignty over Taiwan to China. And so Taiwan is in a state of legal and diplomatic limbo. But what that practically means is that the correct statement of the US position is that the United States does not recognize Taiwan as part of China. But US officials don't say that publicly. But they've been coming closer and closer towards saying that. So in September 2022, Ned Price, and this statement was reiterated a year ago by John Kirby, Ned Price said that the United States, quote, does not take a position on sovereignty with respect to the dispute over Taiwan. So even for a US official to say that was a relatively significant development. But no position isn't really an accurate, like a precise way of stating the US position, because if the US had really no position, then faced with Beijing's claim over Taiwan, the US could neither confirm nor deny. It would just, no position means we do not agree or disagree. But really, the United States disagrees with Beijing. And Laura Rosenberger in January 2024 came closer to stating the real US position in the context of now we're breaking ties with Taiwan. And Rosenberger said that UNGA Resolution 2758, quote, did not make a determination on the status of Taiwan. So Beijing has been asserting its interpretation of the status quo of Taiwan being part of China. And the United States has been closer and closer toward clarifying its position that Taiwan's sovereignty remains undetermined and Taiwan is not either part of China or an independent state. So my perspective on the future of US-Taiwan relations is that the contestation between Washington and Beijing is still going to be centered on the meaning of these terms. But in particular, I think it's going to be focused primarily on this definition of the status quo. Ever since 2016, there has been, as the dispute over Taiwan has become more contentious, the first part of the United States' effort at building an international coalition in support of Taiwan was to reach agreement among US allies and partners on the meaning of peaceful. So Beijing defines peaceful as the absence of force, not necessarily coercion. For the United States and its partners, peaceful means the absence of both force and coercion. And this has been clarified in statements by the G7. It's been clarified in US bilateral statements with Japan, South Korea, and other US allies and partners. And it's also been clarified in statements on Taiwan by US allies and partners in which the United States is not a party to that agreement, that statement. So an example is that Britain and Italy issued a joint statement in which they both defined peaceful, a peaceful approach to the dispute over Taiwan as not including the threat or use of force or coercion. So among US allies and partners, there's already been a consensus on what we mean by a peaceful approach to the dispute over Taiwan. The next area, I think, is going to be reaching agreement on the meaning of the status quo. And on the one hand, that's going to involve countering Beijing's disinformation and lawfare, because Beijing has been very proactive in trying to isolate Taiwan internationally by citing dubious legal statements based on a distortion of UN Resolution 2758. So a part of this is going to be trying to control the narrative surrounding the status quo so that Beijing doesn't exploit that to isolate Taiwan even further. And it's also going to involve distinguishing between the one China policy and the one China principle. The United States one China policy and the one China policy of many US allies and partners involves the position that these countries do not recognize Taiwan as part of China. That's a fundamental difference between US policy and Beijing's one China principle. That's where I see the future of US-Taiwan relations. But I also want to kind of provide a perspective on how people in Taiwan view this issue, in particular the idea of the status quo. Because so my colleagues and I in Taiwan administer a survey called American Portrait, and it covers a range of topics, including US skepticism in Taiwan. But I want to focus right now on the questions we've asked that pertain to this issue of how Taiwanese view the status quo. So first, we have the top set of results is just looking at the entire sample, and then we break it down by partisanship. And so we asked respondents, do you think Taiwan and China are part of the same country? And 78.41% of the respondents in our survey said that Taiwan and China are not part of the same country. As you might expect, DPP supporters tend to believe Taiwan and China are not part of the same country at much higher rates than supporters of other parties. But here's also, I think, a really interesting finding. This really surprised me, that even if you look at KMT supporters, over 55% of self-identified KMT supporters do not agree with the statement that Taiwan and China are part of the same country, which means that the majority of the respondents who support the KMT don't themselves believe in the KMT's platform of the 1992 consensus. And maybe that's sustainable, maybe that they want the KMT to tactically maintain the 1992 consensus as a way of maintaining peace across the strait, even though they don't believe in it themselves. But potentially this could mean there's a divergence between the KMT and the support base, which might mean a weakening of the KMT's commitment to 1992 consensus over the long term. But that's a kind of striking finding that we found in our survey. And we also asked Taiwanese what they think about the nature of the status quo, because the status quo covers the sovereign status of Taiwan, but it also involves what Taiwan calls itself. So even though the United States doesn't recognize the Republic of China, an aspect of the status quo from the US perspective is that Taiwan calls itself the Republic of China. So we asked the respondents in Taiwan, what do you think the name of the country is? So one is, so this is for respondents who said that Taiwan and China were not part of the same country. So what is the name of Taiwan's country name? In Chinese, the Guohao. So the dark blue means respondents said the name of the country is the Republic of China. That's the majority at 37%. And then the slightly lighter blue here, the second row, means Republic of China, Taiwan. The lightest blue here is Republic of China in Taiwan. And then there's Taiwan, and then there's Republic of Taiwan. So that's the spectrum of names that we presented to respondents. We didn't include the Taiwan's WTO name, which is the separate customs territory of Taiwan, Matsu. But I don't think many respondents would say that's Taiwan's actual name as a country. So so what we found was that most respondents either thought that Taiwan was called the Republic of China, and then at a lower rate, about 20%, 21%, the Republic of China, Taiwan. And here's a finding that I found quite interesting, which is that if you look at DPP supporters, they are much more likely to affirm this kind of belief in the Republic of China as a name of Taiwan as a country, even more so than KMT respondents. Even though, if you look kind of previously, DPP supporters do not are much more likely to believe than KMT supporters that Taiwan and China are not part of the same country. So usually you think in Taiwanese politics, the belief in the name of the country as Republic of China and the one China concept tend to be bundled together. But we find that actually for TPP supporters, those are actually quite separate positions that they take. So we also asked respondents, among the 13% of respondents who thought that Taiwan and China were part of the same country, we asked them a follow-up question. So if you think Taiwan and China are part of the same country, what is that country? And the most kind of significant result from this is that, so if we look at this kind of red part here, means that only 0.74% of respondents in Taiwan said that Taiwan was part of the People's Republic of China. And so kind of reinterpreting what that means that over 99% of respondents in Taiwan don't believe in Beijing's one China principle. That's a really striking finding. But even the support rate for the position that Taiwan and China are part of the same country, but they disagree on what the name of the country is. This is kind of similar to the KMT's 1992 consensus, because the KMT's position is that Taiwan and China are part of the same country. For Taiwan, the name of the country is the Republic of China. For Beijing, is the People's Republic of China. So what proportion of respondents in our survey actually indicated support for that kind of a position? It's only about 8.3%. So there's really not very much support for the 1992 consensus, at least among our respondents. So predictably, KMT supporters were much more likely to endorse that view than supporters of other parties. So those are the main findings from our survey. So I've flown about 15 hours to speak for about 15 minutes, but hopefully I'll get a few more minutes in the Q&A. So look forward to your questions.
Thanks everyone. It's great to be back here again. Thank you, Deepa, for inviting me to this. So my task is to talk about the prospects for Taiwan's international space after the elections. And I think the basic story here is I'll agree with status quo kind of story. There's a little bit of change. There's a bit more uncertainty, but by and large, there's a fair amount of continuity, both for good and for ill. And what I want to stress is that Taiwan's international space is key to Taiwan's international security. We still live in a world where if you look much more like a state, you're much more secure than if you look like somebody else's internal territory. And of course, that's where a lot of the battle goes on here. And the forces that affect that are pretty stable in many ways. Taiwan is likely to stay on the current course. Lai Ching-te has made it very clear his policy on many of the issues relevant to international space is going to be a continuation of Tsai Ing-wen's approach. China will continue to squeeze, probably ratcheting it up marginally. And the US, depending on our own wild card in November, will likely stay the course of recently enhanced support for Taiwan and pursuit of cooperation with so-called like-minded states, including Taiwan's remaining diplomatic partners. So what I want to do now is go through a sort of inventory of what have been the long-standing elements of Taiwan's quest for international space and the security that comes with it, giving a sort of good news, bad news story on each of them. And again, it's mostly a story of continuity. So one element has been Taiwan's effort to engage international organizations. The impossible nut to crack has been the so-called states member-only organizations, principally the United Nations. And here Taiwan has a very good case of international law to make that it ticks the boxes, satisfies the criteria for statehood under international law, territory, population, autonomous government, and the capacity to engage in international relations. But that's not enough. It's still a political process. The US has not supported this aspect of Taiwan's international space. That's one of the elements of the 3 no's from the Clinton era, although the US and others have supported participation. And there are signs of growing pushback against China's squeeze on this front. That's the relatively good news, although somewhat mixed. The bad news, and I'll put in a commercial here, Bonnie Glaser and I are about to put out a thing on the legal aspects of UNGA 2758. China has been ratcheting up the pressure here. It's been increasingly trying to portray UN General Assembly Resolution 2758, the thing that gave the Chinese seat to Beijing, took it away from Taipei, trying to portray that as a legal determination binding on everybody. And there's a multi-pronged set of attacks here. They've been going on for decades, but with the 2022 white paper and a few other things, we've seen a ratcheting up of this attempt to claim that, partly based on 2758, Taiwan has no status in international law and is accepted by the UN and binding as something other countries must accept, that Taiwan is a part of China. And here the UN has been a very favorable forum for China because it's one country, one vote, which means mostly the global south, which means mostly countries that don't really see Taiwan as a high salience issue. It's been a problem in the UN structure as well because there are a lot of PRC nationals in UN positions, and there's a lot of kind of unsophistication or acquiescence in many of the concrete actions that the UN takes that have sort of led to a drift in that direction. A second prong in Taiwan's strategy for international space has been to engage in those international organizations with which it can engage. So the UN per se is off the table. but Taiwan has had periods of relative success and relative failure. Of course, the most famous one is the 8 years when it was allowed to attend the WHA meetings as an observer. During the Ma years, that was yanked off the table after Tsai was elected, although there was one meeting that was technically after the transition. But Taiwan has had success in other international organizations, especially ones that are non-state member only. That's a precondition, but also those that are in safe subject matters, not terribly political ones, economic ones, things like APEC and the WTO, and so on. And Taiwan has also succeeded where it's been grandfathered in, where it got there before the PRC did. That's the case of the WTO, which is essentially simultaneous, and APEC, where it was in beforehand. Another area where Taiwan has been relatively successful is where you can make a case that Taiwan is essential to the regime's functioning. Very hard to keep Taiwan out of international trade regimes, at least the big ones. Very hard to say Taiwan doesn't have roles to play in public health, especially after SARS, although less successful after COVID. And basically the argument that Taiwan is a good citizen. It plays by these rules and therefore should be allowed access. That's the good news. There is unfortunately some bad news here in terms of the international organization participation indicator of international status. CPTPP, US walked away from it. Taiwan's not getting in anytime soon. RCEP, a China-centered undertaking where Taiwan has very little hope of joining, even though these are economic-centered organizations. Then there have been some recent losses, like the Central American Parliament Organization, where Taiwan was kicked out of its observer status. It's one of many instances of that sort of thing that's happened over the years. This one, unfortunately, entailed a citation to 2758, so it's tied into that whole China agenda there. Relatively good news is things Taiwan has been able to come up with as an equal partner in shaping it. Things like GCTF, Global Cooperation and Training Framework. So you see this constant back and forth. Taiwan trying to get in wherever it can, and it gets into a lot of organizations that are more symbolic than internationally significant, and being pushed back by China. Here it has not helped that the US has walked away from some of these organizations, or at least weakened its commitment, because after all, the US has been the principal patron for Taiwan's access to a lot of these. Another arrow in Taiwan's international space quiver is maintaining formal diplomatic relations, and then there were 12. From the diplomatic truce that held in place during the Ma Ying-jeou years, we saw Gambia leave near the end, switch recognition thereafter. And it's been steadily falling away, with Nauru being the most recent one, and a particularly disturbing one because of, again, the specific reference to 2758 as settling Taiwan's international status more generally. So does it matter? The answer is yes. The capacity to engage with international relations element of statehood, which is an important element for international status and space, of course, still matters because, ticking the box of diplomatic relations helps. Taiwan's diplomatic allies are an important force for keeping Taiwan on the agenda and visible in international organization. And although Nauru is a counterexample, it tends to be a one-way ratchet. That is, it's hard to claim them back once they've gone away. Here, the thing to watch going forward for Taiwan's international space are two things, I think. One is regional differences. China exerts a lot of pressure in the South Pacific and Oceania, where it's a big player, less so in places like Belize, which are kind of insulated from much influence by China. And there are election risks. Taiwan's diplomatic partners are generally democracies. And we've seen Taiwan-China be an issue in some of these elections, and some of the diplomatic flips have had less to do with Chinese pressure, although many of them are Chinese pressure incentives, and more to do with perhaps indirect effects of those China ties, but really mediated at least through democratic politics. Here, there may be a restraint on China's likelihood of squeezing Taiwan's space further, in the sense that backing Taiwan down to zero is not necessarily in China's interest. It gives Taiwan an incentive to code switch. 5 diplomatic allies, who cares? The real point is TICO and TECRO offices around the world, which give Taiwan extremely robust informal relations. And of course, the risk that China will provoke Taiwan into pushing back once it's cornered. But the big name of the game in terms of international relations is informal relations, particularly support from relatively great powers, the US and others. And here we have seen a real sea change that is, at least if we maintain political continuity, likely to continue, which is a real shift toward stronger support for Taiwan. We've heard references already to Biden saying 4 times that we will defend Taiwan from an unprovoked attack. We keep reciting the catechism of the Taiwan Relations Act with 3 communiques and increasingly the 6 assurances, which is kind of the most pro-Taiwan of the statements. So it's bipartisan. Much of that hasn't changed from Trump 1 to Biden. And we've seen Congress get in the act in a way we haven't seen since the TRA. There's been this raft of legislation since 2016 that is very pro-Taiwan and, for the purposes of this talk, very pro-Taiwan international status, encouraging the maintenance of diplomatic relations, encouraging Taiwan's membership in non-states member-only organizations, and encouraging Taiwan's participation, full membership in those where participation in a wider range. Now, there are challenges here. This is the bad news part of the story. What does strategic ambiguity, what does deterrence mean under current circumstances? That gets tough. It's harder to deter a more powerful and more assertive China. It's harder to reassure a Taiwan which is infected with a bit of Yimeilun. I may be overstated, but it's still certainly there. And that pushes that, plus the fact that there's been no need to deter Taiwan from pushing the independence envelope, means that the signals that are being sent look very much like China bashing, with very little restraint on Taiwan. That then feeds this discussion of the need to assure China, the other side of the shelling story. And that makes it very hard to signal effectively. And that's going to be a challenge going forward. Then there are the other informal relationships. And here Taiwan has scored some gains, which may or may not last. Japan and other regional powers now see Taiwan's security as bound up with their own. That creates incentives to support Taiwan's international space and status. Europe has a couple of vectors here. One is the Lithuania dust-up after Lithuania allowed Taiwan to open a more high-status office, and China did the trade sanctions against Lithuania, and the EU kind of rode to Lithuania's rescue. And of course, there's the Ukraine impact. The China-Russia alignment has woken up Europe to a more skeptical view, if you will, of China, and that has redounded somewhat to Taiwan's benefit. What we don't know, of course, is how deep and how durable this is. We're already seeing issues with the ambiguity, the Ukraine lessons that we talked about in the first panel, and also the question of the depth of commitment and the coherence of Europe and the depth of commitment to Ukraine and in turn Taiwan. The final arrow in Taiwan's quiver of trying to keep international space and expand it has been to engage in highly visible and consciously touted instances of conforming to international norms and acting as if Taiwan were a member of the international institutions and the international treaties that it is not allowed formally to join. There are several examples. The key ones are probably human rights. Taiwan has tried to deposit instruments of ratification with many major UN human rights covenants and conventions and has been rebuffed. Taiwan touts its democratic bona fides and has engaged in the sort of not terribly institutionalized business of summits for democracy or of democracies. And Taiwan has tried to be a good player and to participate as much as it can in the normative and institutional structures that address global challenges. So access to WHA, WHO for pandemic response and things Taiwan did on its own, multilaterally and bilaterally, as well as the UNFCCC, the climate change structure, which again, it cannot join, but has tried to send experts and engage in exchanges and so on. So there's been a lot of success here in terms of international space. Because it doesn't cross the Rubicons where China pushes back very hard and Taiwan has something to contribute, and again, it plays the values card. There are here too, however, rising challenges. These institutions are not what they used to be, right? The WTO has shrunk as a major trading entity compared to these regional arrangements. China is destabilizing the Human Rights Council and human rights norms more generally with a more relativist approach. Democracy ain't doing so well a lot of places. I look around this town. And the global challenges are not exactly being fixed right now. So all these normative things of success with success in perhaps a failing enterprise. So I'm mindful of the time here. This is supposed to be about the elections. I've been told you a story of basically stuff that is there long term that isn't too likely to change. Do the elections change it? Probably not much. As I said at the beginning, we all know the commitment to continuity. Tsai and Lai hit the road was the campaign poster. Why Tsai was left by the side of the road, I don't know. That didn't translate too well to American idioms, but clearly signaling continuity. Xiao Mei-chin, Xiao Kim as the vice president signals continuity as well. And Lai has said all the right things in some contexts about the ROC constitution, sovereignty without formal declarations of independence, engagement with China as an equal. Lining up with fellow democracies in the US, that's all true, that's all good. I think it's assuaged concerns, but there still are the question marks out there. The US has been very fortunate, and Taiwan has been very fortunate, to have 16 years of leaders who were basically trusted and who were familiar to the US and who basically got how to do this. Lai doesn't have that experience, that's what the question marks are there for. There's going to be personnel turnover, and he has said a few things which raised some eyebrows and caused some concerns. I expect the May 20th speech for the inauguration will be further reassuring on this, and that will help. But a divided parliament put some question marks over some of the things Taiwan needs to do to convince the US that it should really be there for some of the international space issues, defense appropriation, and things like that. Finally, that's all about Taiwan's agency. Taiwan has limited agency. What happens from Beijing and Washington will shape Taiwan's opportunities for international space. And here, most of the reaction, as was noted earlier, is pretty standard stuff from both the US and Washington, the US and China. Two minor diversions to watch. One is AIT pushed back harder when Laura Rosenberger was in Taiwan just after the elections, partly in response to the Nauru switch. There was, I think, a stronger statement as one of the examples that James gave. And interestingly, China said, hey, Lai Ching-te didn't get 50%. Maybe the Taiwanese aren't so bad after all. If they'd have kept that door a little bit open, but again, no really major changes. So the question is, what's ahead? We're supposed to talk about Taiwan's 2024 elections. The big election for Taiwan is here, not there. If it's Biden, I think you'll see a lot of continuity. If it's Trump, well, what does Trump think of China? What's he going to do to US alliance structures? Since so much of Taiwan's international space gains have been through the US building with its established allies and informal alignments to counter Chinese pressure and to enhance Taiwan's international space as not being just a product of US support, but rather a multilateral normative interest and a multilateral security interest. What about international organizations? Taiwan has gained by gaining access to these organizations. Trump has not been a big fan. What about the values card? Well, how much will he push those values? And we don't know. I think one needs to be humble about where this goes. I'm, as that suggests, somewhat skeptical and pessimistic, because each of those areas that have been elements of Taiwan's gaining or preserving international space are potentially at risk in the second Trump administration. And I think a lot of the pro-Taiwan stuff that was in the first administration may have to do with some individuals who were essentially delegated Taiwan policy who may not be back. There's also the concern about what Republican isolationism and a, shall we say, authoritarian curious mindset means for how this is going to play out for Taiwan. So I think there are real questions to watch there. Then there are the over-the-horizon elections. What happens to the 9 and 1s in Taiwan? How will China read that, and however it turns out? There is worry among China's Taiwan watchers about what happens when Lai runs for re-election 2028. Will he be facing a tough fight and play to the base and say things that are provocative, or at least they can seize upon? And then there's a question about Xi Jinping. He's met with Ma. What happens when he has to go to meet Mao? When does this become a legacy thing? That I think is something to watch. The 21st Party Congress will probably give us a further clue. Those are mostly over the horizon things. The short term, I think the projection is for continuity with, again, the big orange wild card. That'll stop.
Thank you, Jacques, for that terrific overview and really rounding off the entire day with your remarks. And before I turn it over to the audience, because we do have some time, let me just throw something out that seems to, that all of you perhaps can jump in. But Jennifer, you and most of you have said that the fundamentals seem to be the same after the election, that there's nothing earth-shatteringly different. On the other hand, you also mentioned that there might be a period of maybe, in terms of China, cross-straits, testing the new administration, which often happens. And so this sort of ratcheting up the coercion elements, the gray zone tactics, seems as if they have been, constant, as you say, and exhausting. I'm wondering to what extent that kind of set of tactics can be kept up, because clearly it has to be, the other side also might feel a little bit fatigued. And what is the result of that? What's the ultimate aim of that? Is it just testing? And so how is the US, perhaps, James, looking at that new set of factors that she lays out, and the strategic ambiguity element that you don't want to, that you pointed out, as well as Jacques, the delicate dancing around these issues, is the combination of this new set of coercive tactics, but not forceful. Is that going to provide a new test, not just to Taiwan, but to the US and allies as well? So who wants to go first? Maybe you, Jennifer. Yeah.
Think this on? Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So I guess my view is that actually this dark gray zone activity is quite low cost and easy for Beijing. They have a huge navy, a big coast guard. It doesn't cost them that much to keep these activities up for long periods of time and at high levels, especially when you consider the importance of the Taiwan issue to Xi and to others in China. Right, it's like the core of the core. So it's the cost benefit analysis there, I think, is pretty favorable. Certainly these low intensity activities are much less costly than an actual invasion, and get a good part of the way in terms of what Beijing wants, which is to control and strangle off Taiwan's autonomy. So I've talked a little bit about sort of the military costs, but the other types of activities are even lower cost. I mean, cyber attacks are very low cost. We know that's why Russia relies on them all the time. And Beijing has a number of, infrastructure advantages in terms of its ability to block off or cut off Taiwan's internet access or interfere with their power. China's intelligence agency has saturated Taiwan, so it's pretty easy for them to use that to activate those in sort of any way. So I think it's like actually pretty low cost, and I don't think that it will tire Beijing out in any way. It's also pretty low risk in the sense that there's lots of off ramps. So Beijing is not just testing out the new administration in Taiwan, but also testing out US responses. How far can it push before the US does anything? Both, especially in the military domain, how far can they go in terms of, for example, using some kind of like health quarantine, right? Like, oh, there's a concern about the safety of this product, so we're going to inspect all these ships. Like, how far can they go before the United States responds? And I will also say the US doesn't have a good mechanism to respond to these types of Coast Guard activities. The only comparable thing the US has is like, I can't see our Coast Guard like intervening, and they're not gonna send a merchant marine, but if you send the US Navy, that's an escalation. So there is kind of this quandary. So I think it's testing not just Taiwan, but also the United States. And it's easy for them to ramp it back down, right? You do it for a week, it's not working, or the US is getting upset. Oh, it's over, we're done, and then you do it for another week later on. So the big risk that Beijing faces is just keeping it below that kinetic level and keeping the US and other US allies out. And so in that sense, I think it's actually a pretty low cost, which is why approach for Beijing, which is why I think that it's so likely, much more likely than an amphibious invasion in the next 5 years. Like, I think the 2027 number is like made up basically. So, I understand that's when he wants to be ready, but that's the big difference between like what, when he would actually do it. So
Thank you so much. It's just a follow-up to to James and Jacques. Do you think that it might create a more incentive for the United States to respond more favorably politically then, if it is so difficult to respond in kind, because it could be an escalated steps, more political support in some other fashion? James and Jacques, maybe?
So, I mean, if the response of the United States is primarily political, I mean, there has been some criticism that the United States, in its policy toward Taiwan, has been heavy on symbolism and not strong enough on substance. So there is a kind of the risk that if the U.S. chooses a more of a political approach to Taiwan, that it may aggravate tensions without involving a really substantial concrete support. But the other side of it, the more productive side potentially, is to try to help Taiwan expand its international space and to find ways of supporting Taiwan that are political, but not purely symbolic. So I think that that's potentially the decision the US has to make.
Let's pick up on a couple of threads there. I think on the gray zone stuff, one of the things the US can do is not make it easy for China to make it look okay to do that. I think the Pelosi visit was quite unhelpful in that regard. It gave that cover. I think on the escalatory dynamic, I think one thing we need to appreciate in terms of framing US responses here is that there's a real asymmetry. It's not just the obvious asymmetry that it's China's doorstep and its force projection for us, but when China sends out Coast Guard vessels, which were essentially repainted PLA ships, they're not ordinary Coast Guard vessels, they're white-hulled, formerly gray-hulled. That is both non-escalatory in terms of conflict with the US, but highly assertive in terms of Taiwan as part of ours. We're patrolling our waters, we're patrolling, we're just doing domestic law enforcement. So China has a real advantage in the optics as well as the security issues there. I'm a dissenter on symbolism versus substance. I think that is an easy thing to say, but the boundary between what's symbolic and what's substantive is very vague. And 90% of my talk is about stuff that some people would dismiss as symbols, but I think it actually matters a great deal. I actually worry less about China testing Lai Ching-te. I think they will, and I think we know that. I worry that they've painted themselves into a corner. Tsai Ing-wen was the devil incarnate. Lai Ching-te is worse than Tsai Ing-wen. How do you back off? And Rangidian, how do you give a little? I think there's very little policy space in China for having that conversation, and that actually makes it hard to go down from any escalation of a gray zone.
Okay, great, wonderful. All right, let me now open up the floor, and please raise your hand and also identify yourself and direct your question to whoever you want to. Okay, gentleman in the back. Okay, so did everyone get that question? Okay, do you want to answer that? Okay, go ahead, James.
Briefly comment on that. I don't think neither NATO as an organization nor any individual NATO countries, including the United States, is currently considering stationing permanent military forces in Taiwan. So the United States does provide training to Taiwan, but the US is not stationing permanent military forces in Taiwan. France, to a certain extent, has a secondary role to the role of the United States in that in the 1990s, France sold Taiwan Mirage fighter jets, which are still used for maintaining the defense of northern Taiwan. And the French Air Force conducts an annual exercise to train Taiwanese pilots in the operation of those Mirage fighter aircraft. But NATO has specifically said that it does not envision itself as an organization having a military role in the security of Taiwan, but individual NATO countries will make their own decisions. That was the recent statement from NATO. But NATO as an organization can play a role in terms of arms transfers and arms sales to Taiwan. So Taiwan has recently been asking the US to help it upgrade its tactical data link system from Link 16 to Link 22. And the US has supported that upgrade of its technology. Reportedly, in that kind of decision, it reportedly requires approval from NATO as an organization. And individual NATO countries do play a role in Taiwan's defense economy, but no NATO country is contemplating a permanent military presence in Taiwan.
One quick follow-up on that, which is, I'll take that as adjacent to the Asian NATO question, which is always kicking around. Not going to happen. There's no taste in the region for anything like an attack on one as an attack on all. And I'm not even sure it's in Taiwan's interest because Taiwan's not going to get a defense treaty with the US. And I think an approach that underscores the difference between treaty allies and major non-NATO allies who aren't treaty allies doesn't help Taiwan, and I don't think solves the credibility issues with the US in the Western Pacific.
Yes.
One quick point is that I think actually the the organization, if an organization is going to have a larger role in the Indo-Pacific and the Taiwan question, it should be the EU, not NATO. I don't really, the European militaries are having enough trouble dealing with their own security challenges and getting arms to Ukraine. I think that from the US perspective, it would be more beneficial to have them invest their military resources in Europe. I do think there's a role they could play in sort of the cyber and information domain. And that's why I say the EU is really the actor, like thinking about economics and information and cyber. That's where I think Europe can play a role in helping to increase Taiwan's resilience, not NATO.
Okay, yes.
Hi, thank you. Brandon Lee with.
Could you speak right into the mic? Yeah.
Hi, Brandon Lee. I work in maritime consulting. The US just announced that they're going to be taking a page out of China's book and conducting island building in South China Seas. How much or what impact will that have, particularly since these islands that they're going to be building is hopefully have Taiwan in mind when doing that?
Okay, Jennifer, this might be, looks like yours. Or any others?
So I will admit, I haven't seen that specific report. I mean, I assume that the big challenge the United States faces in the Indo-Pacific is a question of basing and access. The United States wants to distribute its forces around the region so they're less vulnerable to Chinese missiles. And that's especially important for the Army and the Marines. And you know, I'm not going to go into like the detailed operational concepts because we'd be here all day and we'd be confused at the end. But like, you know, the idea is that you station small pockets of forces of ground forces around the region that help with sensing and information and ground-based missiles. And there are advantages to that in terms of deterring and potentially defeating China were they to try to invade Taiwan or have a kinetic blockade. So the rationale behind such a move would be similar to what I think would be like a float bases, right? Like having small places where you can station aircraft and other types of things. I guess, you know, putting them in the South China Sea, like, it's likely that a Taiwan conflict is going to kind of spill out, right? It's not going to all be located in Taiwan Strait. It's going to spill like onto the eastern side of the island as Chinese ships try to interdict US forces as they come from Hawaii. It's going to spill into the South China Sea because that's where the US is going to try to like launch its missiles from in terms of air and naval power so they can be further away from China's you know, direct missile threats. So I assume that they would try to use those islands for that type of activity. I'd have to look kind of more in the details in kind of what they're planning. I think there's a number of like concerns there in terms of thinking about whether or not that's actually a feasible plan. There are questions about how survivable ground forces would be on these types of islands and on a float basis. China has now a pretty robust satellite network, which can allow them to detect them. Especially if they're using fires. As soon as you shoot something, you're really easy to find. So that's one concern. Another is just the infrastructure requirements. Like even our bases in the COFA states like Palau and Micronesia can't really support major air operations because the runways aren't good enough. And the US military construction budget is always getting eaten up by other priorities. So they haven't even like made that infrastructure robust enough. So I'm really skeptical that they're going to be able to build sort of infrastructure that's sufficient for like major air operations or port operations. So I think that while it sounds good in theory and maybe is intended to support the Marines kind of stand-in force concept, I think it may be a lot less practical and useful in reality than the military is always going to tell a good story, but I would have a lot of questions for whoever is behind that plan on some of them I've raised here.
Thanks for that insider view, Jennifer. Yeah.
I haven't heard about the US being involved. I mean, maybe what you're referring to is there's been talk of the US at least looking the other way or quasi-supporting talk by Vietnam and the Philippines of doing essentially tit for tat response to China island building. You know, that's the world we live in, right? After China lost and then scoffed at the international arbitration decision that said their island building is not okay. I think we're just, you know, in that game, and that's out of the box legally. It's you know, these things supposedly have no significance, and you've heard about why they may not matter strategically, but politically, they're just yet another source of friction in the territorial disputes that, you know, are one of the more dangerous things out there now.
I think the US, if the US would look the other way with the idea that these partners would give the US access in the case of a conflict. The US is very optimistic about countries in the region allowing it to put its forces on their territory in a conflict. If you talk to people in the region, they're not very enthusiastic about having US military forces because it makes them a really easy target for China. I think the Philippines and Vietnam are in totally different camps, right? The Philippines is US ally, so there's maybe some wiggle room. There are some in Washington who think that the upgrade in the US-Vietnam partnership means that Vietnam is now on the US side. That's not really, if you talk to Vietnam experts, that's not how they see it. Vietnam is kind of the classic case of a hedger or a balancer or multi-alignment, right? They're building as many partnerships with as many people as possible, and they're not going to choose. And they're certainly not going to choose by letting the US put military force on their territory. So again, a whole lot of questions I would have for whoever is thinking about this plan in the US DoD.
Thank you. I just have to say that I was just in Vietnam about 3 weeks ago, and I met a lot of people at think tank, the government, and the question about US Vietnam strategic relations being upgraded. And the way one of them described it was that they want a balanced relationship with the US and with China, not balancing against China, because they can't afford it, basically. I thought, that's right. So, all right. Any questions? Okay, well, I think they have actually probably answered all the questions that they could have thought of in their presentations, but we also had some of this come up during the first panel. And because this is related to the elections, and I'm going to press my luck here and ask one more final quick question about the fact that you've got a divided legislative yuan. It just came up. Now, is there any concern among the panelists here that there might be some contestation about how to respond to China or policy toward the US? Or is it just continuity? James, why don't you go?
I can just maybe provide a few comments from our public opinion research. In this survey, American Portrait, we actually focused primarily on perceptions of US credibility and perceptions of Chinese credibility among Taiwanese respondents. And so what we found is that overall respondents think the US is, 3 times the number of respondents think the US is credible compared to respondents who think China is credible. But there was a decline in perceptions of US credibility between 2021 and 2022. And then between 2022 and 2023, it's remained relatively stable. We don't have direct evidence to prove why that was the case, but we think that this dip in US credibility may have been due to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But what we did was we kind of broke down the survey evidence based on partisanship. And so what we find is that perceptions of US credibility are heavily influenced by a Chinese identity and KMT partisanship. So generally speaking, supporters of the DPP are much more likely to see the US as credible and to believe in the signaling effects of US assurances to Taiwan, where supporters of the KMT, and by implication those who have more of a Chinese identity in Taiwan, tend to be much more skeptical of the US's credibility and tend to be much less likely to kind of positively receive US efforts to signal support for Taiwan. And we also actually polled respondents on how this applies to TSMC as well. And so looking at the Silicon Shield argument, if TSMC is so important for Taiwan's security. We found that DPP supporters were more likely to interpret TSMC in a positive way, that because TSMC is important for the US will defend Taiwan, and KMT supporters were more likely to say, because TSMC is investing in Arizona, the United States won't defend Taiwan. So we just find that the perceptions of the United States are heavily divided along partisan lines.
Okay, all right. No, that's good. No, that's good. Open some eyes. Anything else? Yep.
Just want to pick up on a point that Shelley made earlier about how there's less and less gap in the practical cross-strait policies of the major parties in Taiwan, but there's this image thing. And so, you know, the partisan dynamic here is that although Taiwanese elections now seem increasingly, finally, after years of being promised, to be fought significantly on domestic policy issues, they're still, partly because it's so hard to deliver on domestic policy promises, and it's even harder with a divided legislature and a divided government. There is a real risk that as elections get near, we'll lapse back into, even though there's not a ton of practical policy differences, the image matters. And so each side's going to say the other is disqualified on cross-strait issues. So party of war, party of surrender. And that has the risk of a sort of back loop that can have this, you know, spiraling, I won't say out of control, but spiraling into a place where it makes things worse rather than better. That's partly divided government, I think, also partly closely fought elections, which it seems like Taiwan and many other democracies seem fated to have for the next God knows how many cycles, assuming we continue to have cycles.
Okay, I think that's a perfect way to end the conference for today, bringing both the domestic politics and the international part together. So with that, I just want to thank my outstanding panelists and the equally brilliant presentations in the morning. Thank you all. Thank you to my panelists and to all of you who have come out today. And please go out and enjoy the sun. You've got an extra few minutes here today.